Welcome back. This is lesson 26, Illiberalism. Now, a quick definition. Illiberalism is when you have a society that identifies as a liberal democracy. So, a society like Canada or the United States, based on civil liberties, that proclaims itself to be an open society, but it begins to exercise very limiting authoritarian-like behaviors, methods, and policies. So to look at illiberalism, we're going to look at Canada and the United States. So we have a Canadian example of illiberalism, including the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, Ukrainian Canadians during World War I. We can look at Canadian illiberalism with many of the relationships established under the Indian Act, including residential schools. We can look at the U.S. illiberalism by looking at the USA Patriot Act. We can look at U.S. illiberalism by looking at their experiences with Japanese Canadians as well. And here we go. So it is a connection to the U.S. Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter. What I'd like you to be able to do, once again, is don't talk about the U.S. Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter generally. Talk about it very specifically. So if there is an illiberal action or policy in the United States because it's an invasion of privacy, link that to the Fourth Amendment. Link it specifically to the amendment that is meant to uphold privacy of American citizens in their relationship with government. Here's a review, a link at what individual and collective rights look like. So if you can't remember the difference between individual and collective rights in some of the examples, there they are. And here's another Prezi that looks at liberal versus illiberal. So if you are someone who enjoys looking at Prezis and wants to dig a little deeper down that rabbit hole, then we have some Prezis here for you to really add to your learning. So, liberal versus illiberal. That didn't come out that clear, neither did that. So we have the conscription crisis in Canada. Anytime that you force Canadians to go to war, fight, and potentially murder and die for your country, that begins to look a lot illiberal. Internment of Japanese Canadians. We have the War Measures Act, including its use in the FLQ crisis. We have the Emergencies Act, which replaces the War Measures Act. We have anti-terrorist legislation. The textbook does a good job talking about that as well. We have the USA Patriot Act. And we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and specifically how those previous incidences show violations of some of the principles on which we proclaim to be an open society. There's some videos linked here as well that you can dive into those topics in a little greater detail. One example that gets a lot of publicity on the diploma exam is the Red Scare. Now, the Red Scare is a witch hunt that happened in the United States, although to some extent, as the cartoon shows, it happened here in Canada as well. And the Red Scare is a witch hunt against communists. So I need you to be familiar with illiberalism and how it connects to McCarthyism in the United States. So here we have a bit of government propaganda trying to raise the alarm that America is vulnerable to communism, rally the troops against it. So we have the vilifying of communism, and that kind of indoctrination and propaganda you would expect to see in an authoritarian state, not in an open society where a multiplicity of opinions is meant to be promoted. So here, communism's not being allowed to coexist in America or being promoted, and that's why it is illiberal. How to spot a communist. So there's a video here about how to spot a communist from the government, and that kind of indoctrination is key to illiberalism. The idea that we must name them, keep a watch on those communists. Here's a ad from a comic book that is trying to target kids and say, you know what, kids, we need you to obey the state, not your parents. So if your parents are communists, you have to tell the state about it. Duties of a citizen during the era of Soviet expansionists. We have videos there for you as well. I have a link for more detail on McCarthyism and a nice summary of the Red Scare in about 10 minutes. So that's a video that's linked there as well, and some other examples of illiberalism and how it leads to the usurpation of freedom under HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and some great cartoon work here as the very vehicle that is meant to be protecting Americans, the House Committee of Un-American Activities, ends up being the vehicle that is hurting the Americans. So definitely another little rabbit hole that you can go down like that guy, trying to find out to what extent democracy is flawed. I think I know that place. So we had loyalty boards and HUAC and blacklisting in Hollywood and McCarthyism and people making false accusations against others to discredit their careers. There's that cartoon that we had embedded in that Prezi. And here's another cartoon about the idea of, instead of being free from fear, freedom from fear, the people are now fearful of their government. And there's a nice TED Talk here on McCarthyism that is a definite must watch. Must watch. So after watching that, you'll know more about McCarthyism for sure. But you can see that McCarthyism is coming up. We have a whole section under illiberalism about McCarthyism. So that's going to be a key case study. Now, another key case study is the War Measures Act here in Canada. And the War Measures Act has been used in 1917 with regards to the conscription crisis. And there's some background information there for you. But the War Measures Act was also used in Canada with regards to the internment of Japanese Canadians. Here's a great video, although from a U.S. perspective, about the internment of, in their case, Japanese Americans. Very, very well done. It talks about the idea of illiberalism and citizenship and loyalty. We also have illiberalism during the FLQ crisis. And we have some summaries of the FLQ crisis. We have a very detailed Prezi here on the FLQ crisis. Now, the FLQ crisis does sometimes appear on the multiple choice exam, so it's not only enough to consider having it so that you can use it on an essay. It's important to know the nuances of that case study for content for exams as well. USA Patriot Act being contemporary case study is all over the diploma exam, and while it should be, we need you to be able to identify what it did, and that's why we have some notes here for you. We have a Prezi or a document that compares the FLQ crisis with the crisis in America in your lifetime. We have this idea of the related war against terrorism and how U.S. foreign policy may or may not actually be creating some of the opposition against America. If you zoom in here, you can see a great summary of the USA Patriot Act and how it changes the relationship between the citizens and their government. So that is definite key information that we'll want you to know going into your exams. And there's some speeches regarding the controversy surrounding the War Measures Act. You need to understand how some people see it as a threat to their freedom. There's a summary of the USA Freedom Act as it updates the USA Patriot Act. Sorry, I've been saying War Measures Act. And there's some cartoons here about the USA Patriot Act as well, how it's changed America since 9/11. Many of these cartoons are of the type of writing that is often on the diploma exam. So we've got a TED Talk here that looks at fear driving American politics, U.S. government spying upon its people, the idea of a surveillance state, tons of little avenues to go down here as well. We have a summary of the Canadian version. We have the Emergencies Act, straight out of the textbook. We have our Anti-Terrorist Act summarized for you. We have a nice cartoon talking about the counterbalance between liberties and counterterrorism. And we have some protest pictures of people protesting against then Prime Minister Stephen Harper's attempt at Bill C-51. And definitely anytime that you see a photograph like this, it's an opportunity for you to practice your A1 skills. Also, the term rendition and its attachment to the story of Mara Arar is definitely an important consequence of the war on terror and 9/11. As too is the story of Omar Khadr. So we definitely want you to be aware of the background stories of Mara Arar and Omar Khadr and how they were connected to the war on terror and the consequences of September the 11th. All right. So lots of stuff about illiberalism. Check-in summary about illiberalism at the end gives you some notes, gives you some summary of some of the major case studies, including the Japanese Canadians, including the FLQ, and definitely the war on terrorism, and Omar Khadr and Mara Arar are here in the anti-terrorist legislation and the USA Patriot Act as well. Now, as we look through illiberalism, one of the recurring themes here is freedom versus control. Also, a recurring theme here is individualism and collectivism. What kind of relationship do we want between our government and our people? Should citizens be obedient, or can they question the state?